day. All right, so 2 Chronicles 25, notice verses 1 and 2. It says, Amaziah was 25 years old when he began to reign, and he reigned 29 years in Jerusalem, and his mother's name was Jehoaddan of Jerusalem. And he did that which was right in the sight of the Lord, but not with a perfect heart. So by this time, the kingdom has been divided. You have basically what was called 12 tribes, and the whole name of the country to begin with was Israel. Then after Solomon dies, the kingdom is divided in his son's time period, Rehoboam, and then there was a man by the name of Jeroboam, no relation, but Jeroboam took the northern, it's not even the half, he actually took 10 tribes, that was called Israel. It retained that name. The southern kingdom was called Judah when you read it in the Bible, or it would say that they were the king in Jerusalem. So you had the very small kingdom where Jerusalem was. There was a king. If you're reading through the Bible, you're going to see the king of Israel, the king of Judah, back and forth. In this case, we've got Amaziah. And he happened to be the king in Judah, and that's significant because of the two kingdoms, the northern kingdom, Israel, was much more wicked and went further off the rails a lot quicker than the southern kingdom did. The southern kingdom, for the most part, in fact, I'm sure of this, was basically, it would be David and then Solomon and then Rehoboam, and after that it was all David's seed. For the most part, they were the more spiritual, but not always. Now notice verse number 6, all right? It says, he hired also 100,000 mighty men of valor out of Israel for 100 talents of silver. So the verses we didn't read, verses 3 through 5, he's amassing an army of his own people. So he's getting this army together. But he decides, I'm going to hire soldiers from the northern kingdom. And the Bible says he hired 100,000, kind of like mercenaries. He says, I'm going to hire these to help me. And I think the leverage that he has there, he says, I'm going to pay for them. He didn't ask them for the help. He says, I'm going to give them 100 talents here. And he thinks that's going to be suffice enough in case a war break out. But notice verse 7. But there came a man of God to him, saying, O king, let not the army of Israel go with thee, for the Lord is not with Israel, to wit, with all the children of Ephraim. So the man of God plainly says, don't use them. God's not with Israel. You're going to bring something bad upon yourself by hiring these soldiers. Notice what he says here in verse 8. But if thou wilt go, do it. Be strong for the battle. God shall make thee fall before the enemy. Now, at first you see, it sounds like God's saying, go for it. But God's saying, he's saying it like sometimes we say things. He says, you go ahead and do it if you want to, is the way we would say it. And you go ahead and you be strong in the battle. But notice what he said. God shall make thee fall before the enemy. Now, you know the king didn't want to hear that. For God hath the power to help and to cast down. So this is not the sermon here, but this kind of goes along with verse 9 where the sermon is. So when I look at that and I realize God's saying, look, okay, you've hired these soldiers, 100,000, and they're paid, and they're going to do what you want because you've paid them, you've hired them. But the man of God says you don't want that because you may have hired them, he says, but God's not going to be with this battle. As a matter of fact, God has the power to win the battle for you, to be victorious, and God has the power to make you be defeated. And, of course, when the king heard that, he thought, oh, me. Notice what the king says in verse 9. This is where our sermon is going to fall. And Amaziah said to the man of God, but what shall we do for the 100 talents which I have given to the army of Israel? What a unique thing to ask first. And the man of God answered, and here's our sermon for the day, the Lord is able to give thee much more than this. So here's what's interesting here. Obviously, the first great principle is you want God to bring the blessing upon you. My number one priority in this church right here is to make sure that we're going to do, I do, and we can do what we can do to make sure the hand of God is going to bless us. Because if we go through all the motions and do everything that we do, and God says, but you don't understand, I'm not going to promote, then that's a big problem. And God is the one who determines that. And without looking at all those 7 churches in Asia Minor, the very last book of the Bible, Revelation, speaks about 7 churches in which God says, if you don't fix even one problem that you have, I'm going to come in there and remove the candlestick, which is symbolic. I'm going to take the messenger out, and you'll no longer be a church. You'll be an assembly, but you won't be a church. You know what makes church church? It's not the pews. It's not the steeple. It's not even the people. It's God says, I will start the church, I will meet with you, and that's what makes the church church. Having a gathering of people is not what makes church church. God makes the church. And I'd hate to know that I sat in a place where God says, you know what, I'm not within 100 miles of that place. We don't want that. The man of God was trying to warn the king, look, you've hired these people and you put out a lot of expense. And the king said first off there in verse 9, he said, but what are we going to do for the 100 talents? You know what he was saying? I've spent this money, and here's all the expense. In other words, his big concern seemed to be, well, what are we going to do? I've paid all this money. It could have been that someone says, wait a minute. In fact, notice what happens in verse 10 after he hears this. Then Amaziah separated them to wit the army that was to come to him out of Ephraim to go home again. Wherefore their anger was greatly kindled against Judah, and they returned home in great anger. So he listens to the man of God here. The rest of the story doesn't end very well, but we're not going to focus on that. The focus here, Amaziah says, I'll tell you what, okay, I'm going to send them home. And those soldiers, imagine having 100,000 soldiers that wanted to go fight. These are people that said, man, we want to fight. You've paid us, that's what we're paid to do. He said, I'm not going to use you. So they go home very angry, and that cost them something later on. So here's what someone probably said when he sent them home. Wait a minute, king. You took the money, and we'll just say you took the country's money, if you please, and you bought all these soldiers, and now you're sending them home. You imagine him having the answer for that one, all right? I think that was one scenario he was thinking. He says, I've already hired them. What else can I do if I've already hired them? He did tell them to go home, and to be honest with you, they were very angry, but at least he does do that. So he's saying here, what am I going to do with all this money that I've spent? And the man of God answered and said, the Lord is able to give thee much more. So here's the practical application today. The problem is that he thought he would be in great shape if he had 100,000 more soldiers. You know, it seems like it makes sense when you've got a big crowd for anything. Everybody thinks if there's a big crowd, then there must be something right with it. Everybody likes to fit in the big crowd sometimes. Not everybody wants to stand alone. Not everybody says, you know what? What's this one person doing over here? What's that little group over here? Well, that's the ones that God says is right. What's this big crowd? That's the ones that either don't care or wants to be in a big crowd. Did not Jesus say that broad is the way that leads to destruction? Narrow is the way. You know why it's narrow? Because there's not that many, and the narrow way is the Jesus way. Now, you've got people today, religious people, and they want to say, well, why don't we all work together? If we all band together, we'll do more. Well, people have tried that, and it does not work. Because the doctrines of the Bible, that the ones that don't believe in the Bible, it always works out that the ones who have the Bible convictions have to bow down to the people that don't have the Bible convictions. It's like you can put one rotten apple in a barrel of apples, 100 apples. Those 100 will not make the one better, but that one apple will make the rest of them rotten. You know why? Because that's the way life works. Jesus said a little leaven leaveneth the whole lump. You put a little leaven in some dough and the whole thing will start rising. It doesn't take much. And I believe in this situation right here where we look at the man of God saying, look, I don't care if you've hired 100,000. I don't care how much money you paid. God is not in it. We need to get back to the day where people say at the very top of the line, the greatest priority is God in it. Is God in it? Is God in it? Because it doesn't matter how big the crowd is. It doesn't matter how much the money is. I'll tell you what's most important is God in it. God's able to raise and God's able to defeat. And God says you don't want that on you. And in this case, Amaziah says, okay, then I'm going to send them home. So here's the thing. We don't need the world's help to do God's will. Everybody thinks we've got to go to the world and say, how are we supposed to build a church world? The church was never made for the world. The church was made for God's people. And there's many examples down through history. And even in the Bible, where sometimes that crowd got very, very small. You know why? Because God was in that, but he wasn't in the real big thing. Now, I'm not against big if God's in it. But God's not always in big. And sometimes God's not in the little either. You could be all by yourself and be wrong, but I know this. When it comes to right, there's a lot of people that you find out the crowds will dwindle and go away when you really take your stand. Because people say, well, you can't do it without a big crowd. You can't do it without all the support. We'll do it with God. We'll do it with God, and God has shown himself that way. Let's remind ourselves of Gideon, who had 32,000 soldiers. And God says it's too many, because what's going to happen is, if you win the battle with 32,000, you're going to think 32,000 of us won this battle. God says, go and make an announcement. Okay, what's the announcement, God? Go and find out who's afraid to go fight and let them go home. Guess how many go home? 22,000. I would be ashamed to be in a big army like that and say, you know what, I'm going to go with all. And that's interesting, because it looked like, I'll guarantee you, when they started walking away, somebody said, well, if they're going, I'm going. Not realizing, hey, what you're saying is, I'm not with Gideon, God's man. Some people don't want to be with God if they got to stand alone or with a crowd that looks like, well, who's this little crowd over here? Who's these little makeshifts over here? I tell you what, they're God's people. And God says, you still got too many. Well Lord, we trimmed it down to 10,000. That's not a bad army, but it's not 32,000. And God says, it's too many. Go make them drink water. And guess what he ended up with? 300 people. Now, you do that today, unless you know God and you believe his word. I'll tell you what, most people will go with the 22,000 that went home afraid, and the others that God says, I can't use them. 9,700, you go home too. I'm going to use 300 to win the battle. I'm here to tell you, God puts examples in the Bible. Hey, how about the 3 Hebrew boys? Look, God's people were in Babylon, and there were thousands there. When Nebuchadnezzar built that big image and says everybody's going to bow down to it, we're going to start playing the music. When the music plays, you bow down to this 90-foot golden image. Everybody started doing it, except you know how many? 3. Now, how many Israelites did you believe got on their faces and bowed because they're afraid to die? Or they looked around and said, you going to bow? No, I'm not going to. Yeah, I'm going to bow because I'm afraid. 3 of them stood up. And by the way, the 3 that seemed to be the closest to Daniel must have been on a trip, because I know he wouldn't have bowed. He must have been somewhere else. But those had already been through something together. And there they stand. And the king says, how dare they? Who are these 3 over here? That's them Hebrew boys. Shadrach, Meshach, and Abednego. You changed their names. You know who they are. Bring them up front. You'll bow or you'll die. You know what they said? Then we'll die. If God delivers us, then he delivers us. If he doesn't, then we'll die. It's fine. This is the way it's going to work. We're not going to bow down to your image. I don't care if there's 3 of us. I'd like to know I'd be one of the 3, not one of the thousands that would just put their face on the ground and say, well, I'd rather live than to die. Look, I'd rather die for God. You hear me? I'd rather die for God, because the people in the Bible who love God, that's the way they did it. We've had way too many down through history who died for this country, who died for right. And there have been people that's turned their tail and run. Cowards is what they are. Cowards. God says, I'm looking for people that will take the stand for God, that will take the stand. In this case, it's the reverse. Well, I paid all this money. Doesn't matter how much money you've paid. The Lord is able to give thee much, much more than this. We don't need the world's help to do God's will. We do not, and people that don't believe in that, you can believe it all you want to. I'm here to tell you that God knows what he's doing. God sometimes waits, and the people that love God, you've got to be patient. You hear me? You've got to be patient and let God do it. Because when we go ahead of God, I'm going to tell you something, we're going to pay a price, and God is not going to be in it. Now you say, well, I don't know about that, preacher. You go right ahead. I'm standing here with faith in Almighty God, reading these stories, looking through the Bible, and knowing that I'd rather go down with the ship with God than to ride the calm seas with the devil's crowd. Any day. Any day. Now I'm here to tell you, there's people you're going to have to, there's a line drawn in the sand. Elijah says, hey, God's people, how long do you halt between 2 opinions? Are you going to serve God? Or are you going to serve the gods that Ahab and Jezebel and that crowd are serving? There they stand. Because I'll tell you what, we'll have a showdown then. The God that answers by fire, that God, will you let him be God? I think they all said, well, I guess. There they stand looking around. What are we going to do? Jezebel had hundreds of false prophets. How many did God have at that moment? At least standing up and saying something about it. He had one. One man. Oh, Elijah, there he was. He said, build you an altar. You guys go first. You pray, you do whatever you got to get a hold of your gods. And they hollered and screamed, even cut themselves. Jumped up and down. And actually, Elijah made fun of him a little bit. He says, maybe you ought to talk a little bit louder. He might be on a trip. Maybe he can't hear you. Maybe he's taking a nap. Hey, that's in the Bible. You say, well, I don't like when preachers get sarcastic. Then you wouldn't like Elijah. If we had Elijah for revival, you wouldn't like him either. First time you heard him, you say, hey, he's one of them kind. Yeah, he's one of my kind. Oh, Elijah. He says, you guys done? We're done. They're wore out. It's all right. All this altar you've got here, I tell you what, start adding water to it. This thing was dry to start with. To me, I would have, if I was one of them false gods, I would have taken a rock and just kind of put some rocks together, made some kind of fire, just to fake it out. He said, pour water on it all. Pour more water. Pour water. The thing was soaking with water. And I think if you go back, I think he prayed 63 words. And the fire came down and consumed everything. The water, the wood, even the rocks were consumed. He says, now there's God. Now you either serve that God who answered by fire, or you go ahead and serve these false gods. You know what? I want to be with the one man if he's standing alone and say, you know what? I'm with Elijah here. I'm glad Elijah says, you know what? I'm going to be his right-hand man until God takes him to heaven through a chariot of fire. I'm here to tell you, look throughout the Bible, you're going to find sometimes very, very small numbers. Paul and Silas in jail. And boy, great revival breaks out amongst the two. All I'm here to tell you is this: God is able to give thee much more than this. Number two, God is more interested in his will and way than the world's, for sure, and even our perception of it. If we're not careful, we try to tell God, here's how you have to do it, God, or it won't work. I think we need to step back and let God be God. God's given us a book called the Bible, and it's always worked. Always worked. God's way always works. And if God's way ends a certain way that we don't agree with it, then we're going to let God be God. But I know this. God, I want to be interested in his will. And that's why you search the scriptures. You pray to God, God, thy will be done. What are we supposed to pray every day as a child of God? Thy will be done. Thy kingdom come. You're our Heavenly Father. You have a will. You have a way. He told us not to go out and beat our brains against a wall trying to figure out how we're going to put clothes on our back and pay the mortgages and live. God says, look, seek ye first the kingdom of God and his righteousness, and all these things shall be added unto you. You'll have plenty. You'll never have to worry about anything if you'll put God first. And that's what we've got to do. Why? Because the Lord is able to give thee much more than this. If he's worried about having to explain, well, you paid 100 talents to these soldiers, and we're not even going to use them. Yeah, but God will give you much more. Hey, by the way, the very fact that you've got God on your side, that makes up for all the money anyway. And then lastly, I know I probably already said this, but just officially, God is interested in blessing and helping and using us in his plan. That's what he wants to do. That's why when you look in the Bible, you'll always find at least one person that God says, you know what, I'll use you. I'll use you. You know that the Apostle Paul, as much as we think we would love him if he were living today, you look in the Bible and there was a time when the Apostle Paul had nobody on his side. He was forsaken. He was forsaken. He even mentioned some people by name. He says, well, this one, he's turned on me. I'll just turn him over to God. There's this one. I don't have anybody right now. But you know what Paul learned? But I've got God. And God will put you in that position sometimes just so you'll say, you know what, but I've got the best. I've got the one that can bring anybody and bring me the support or the encouragement, whatever it is. But God is interested in blessing and using us in his plan. You know what? Here's the unique thing about today. Of course, we don't know when the Lord's going to return. We don't know that. I will say this, if things are even going to be close to, and I know the Bible speaks of this, anywhere close to the spiritual level that it was when Jesus was born. In other words, when Jesus came to earth the first time, was born, what was the spiritual level like amongst his people, we'll say? Very, very low. You know, the angel said to the shepherds, you go and look where Jesus is. And they went and told some people. But you're talking about nobody made a big deal about Jesus being born. It's almost like it happened, it's done, and then it was quiet. You know why? Because the spiritual level was terrible. Then when the wise men show up and say, hey, we want to go worship this king. We've been following this star in the east. And there's a king, and Herod says, oh, well, if you find him, let me know. I'll worship him too. You know that wasn't going to happen. Of course, they're warned to leave town and because the child would be in danger. So when the wise men leave, and Herod says, you know, I'll fix this situation. Though I'll kill every boy, child, 2 years and under, and I'll make sure I get all of them. Let me ask you something. If the government today says we're going to go and we're going to take from your possession, moms and dads, your children, 2 years or any age, what would any red-blooded American do? I'll tell you, we'd fight. We'd fight over my dead bodies, what we would say, wouldn't we? But you know, that happens. It's almost like, well, what are we going to do? Look, I would rather die trying to help somebody than just sit around and go, well, I don't know what I'm supposed to do, and we're kind of helpless here. We're never helpless without God. We need to rise up again and be courageous for God once again and do what God asks us to do, even if you do it all alone. That's what God's looking for. Look for those who will stand alone even with God. I'll tell you what, though, but God will also get some people to rally around you. You know what I'm looking for around? I'm looking for people to rally around what we're trying to do here. And people that don't want to do it, look, I'm not going to be heartbroken, but I'm not trying to have some kind of milquetoast ministry here. I'm trying to say, look, we want God's full blessing on you. We want you to be able to stand before God and God say, hey, you had a messenger that was preaching the word. What part about that would you not obey? Rather than God say, you know what, you didn't have much of a preacher. He wouldn't preach the Bible. He was afraid. He put his finger to the wind and said, whatever's the popular thing, we'll just do that. And people not hear the word of God and live a life that's not pleasing to the Lord. I'm here to tell you, whatever it is you're afraid of by serving God, I'm here to tell you that God will give you much more than this. The people think you got to do it this way. Here's a man who says, you know what? I think I'm going to need an extra 100,000 soldiers, and I'm willing to go to the northern kingdom, which I think he had an idea. The very fact he had to hire them. Really, technically, these people were all related in a sense. This was still, even though the kingdom's divided, it's still their people. But to show up and say, I tell you what, if we need some people to fight with us, I'm willing to pay you. I tell you what, there's a lot of people, you pay them to fight, they'll fight. Hey, take a boxer. If someone walked in that door right there and said, I tell you what, I'll give you $5 million to go 10 or 15 rounds with somebody. Now, we'll tell you, I said, you don't have to tell me who it is. You'll give me $5 million to go 10 or 15 3-minute rounds. That's right. Win or lose. Sign me up. Where do I show up? And I'll go do some. You say, you're crazy. No, it's hypothetical. Don't walk out and say, well, the preacher, he's going to go be a boxer. I'd box for Jesus, but you know what I'm saying. A lot of people do a lot of things for money. And there are people that will get their brains beat out for much more money than that. I'm here to tell you that here's a man that says, I need 100,000 more just to secure victory in the country. Hey, you're missing it, buddy. You're missing because the rest of the story, we won't read it. He made a bad mistake because he still didn't follow God wholly, and he paid the price for it. And God says, do you want me on your side? Or do you want all this world and all this crowd you think you've got to have? I'll take God every time. I'll take God every time. By the way, he's the mighty one anyway. Sometimes it looks like, where is God? Why doesn't he show up and really take the stand? Sometimes he does, and sometimes he says, this is the will. This is the way it is. Now here I'm going to go back to that illustration. I'm done. We're going to get out early today. Maybe. I've got extra time. That's always dangerous when I look at it because I think I've got a lot of extra time. But here's what I was going to say. You say, right now, preacher, the spiritual level in our world is what? It's getting lower and lower by the day. Now, you know what? Here's a sad thing. And I know I've preached 3 sermons on this, but I'm going to say this anyway because it might be my last one anyway for a lot of reasons. But has anybody here ever served in the United States Navy? Well, I know there's some of you serve in the armed forces. How would you like to have as a representative of your branch of service a transgender? That's the poster boy, girl, man, binary, whatever. That's what the United States Navy is promoting. If you want to come be in the Navy, hey, by the way, big boys, come on in here. We'll let you put on drag clothes. Now you say, preacher, really, that's a spiritual problem. That's people saying we would rather cave. By the way, do you really know what the percentage in this country of people that are of any of that kind of stripe? It's very, very low. It'd be like me trying to sell lemonade to you here, and only 3 of you really want it. But I'm making it sound like all of you love it. I'm here to tell you that it's a spiritual problem. Somebody in the United States government thinks, well, we better include those people because we dead sure don't want to offend those people. If you could get every transgender or drag queen to join the Navy, you wouldn't have that many anyway. But to think that somehow in the United States Navy's mind, and that had to go through a bunch of desks to get there, you know that. That had to pass through the president's desk. We already know where he stands on that. He's pushing it. It's a wonder that God don't already do something. Any day I could see God just raining the fire down on us. But here's the thing. They had to pass through a lot of desks. Somebody said, well, we don't want to offend that crowd. You know what that crowd is? It's got those kind of problems. They're perverse. That's like somebody saying, we don't want to offend this group because we need them. You don't need them. We need to be good, decent people. The truth is, in this nation, millions of people make up good, decent people. I'm not saying all of them are saved and all of that, but I'm saying these are people that don't want that. They know that's wrong. They know it's against nature. They know it's against the God, even if they don't even prescribe to be a Christian. They know that's wrong. And somebody says, well, we got to do that. No, we don't have to do it. I don't mean you got to go out here and treat them bad. You can just ignore it and say, be that way. Look, do that if you want to. But to say we're going to take a branch of the service, now imagine this. You know what that's setting ourselves up for? That's God saying, whoever made the decision that we need to bow down to that kind of mindset, and these are people that stand up for this country. Now, you know the mass majority of people in the Navy and the armed services in the whole country don't believe in that stuff. But God will judge that kind of decision. Amaziah made a bad decision following this. At least he didn't cave that, but afterwards he made a bad decision. He decided he wasn't going to serve God. And sadly, a lot of people pay that price. You know what bothers me here? If I don't live for God, it's going to affect somebody, and I know it'll affect somebody's children if I don't serve and do right. I will stand before God. And I want one day the young people that come through these doors here, and if they hear me one time, they're going to say, you know, well, that preacher, I know he stood on those things. That's perverse. That's against God. Man, I don't want anybody that's young or anybody to say, well, that preacher, he's soft on that. Look. I'm not going to be soft on that. It's perverse. It goes against God Almighty. It also goes against God when we come in here headlong and we won't listen to God. Well, we got to do it this way. I tell you, we got to do it God's way. God's way, God's way, God's way. The Bible way, that's the way. Hey, you spend all that money, send them home. You ain't got to get the money back. God will give you much more than I think he was saying. Look, you're worried about 100 talents. God owns all the cattle on all the hills, all the gold in all the world. God made that. If you're worried about money, God will take care of your needs. People say, well, you're not going to get your needs met in church if you don't cave to this, cave to that. Hey, we're doing okay because God will supply the need. I personally, and I know others could testify, and I'm done here. You said, you're going to be done early. I'm still early. I had a mother that raised us kids. Janet knows this because it's her sister. And I'm here to tell you because if you don't believe me, you go and ask this woman the life that we lived. We put God first. Hey, you see this offering plate down here or wherever they're at? The offering plates. There were times we didn't have any money for anything. But my mother was going to make sure God got his. She was not going to rob God. Somebody says, well, you need that extra 10%. No, we needed the God who will bless us for putting him first. Now you look at me. I'm not starving. I'm not some poor. I'm not malnourished because we didn't have enough food to eat as a kid because we put God first. I need to scale back as it is. The point is we put God first. Well, those kids are not going to get good grades since you're running around the world going to every revival. you go to church, but you don't come straight home. Those kids need to do their homework. We did fine with our homework. I'm not bragging. I could test with the best of them. We wasn't hurting scholastically. You know why? Because I believe God said, you know what? There's somebody putting God first. Now, there's times it was lean, but God took care of us, and He's always took care of us, and He'll take care of all of us. He'll take care of this church. He'll take care of our nation if we'll put God first. But I'm here to tell you, God is able to give thee much more than this. If you're worried about the finances, God says, I'll take care of that. You're worried about an invading army not being able to take care of God, I'll take care of that. Look, hey, I've made people go to sleep and never wake up. Sennacherib's army was not defeated by any bows or arrows, or I think 186,000, if you go back and read the story. God put them to sleep, and they just never woke back up. You know what God says? Don't you worry. You put me first, and I'll take care of things. So Amaziah, you made a good decision there. After that, you didn't. But I'll give you credit for at least listening to the man of God when the man of God says, hey, just send them home. I don't care if they're mad. But they're going to be mad. Hey, people get mad about things. You understand that. But if you're doing the right thing, you're convinced it's the right thing, then go ahead and do it. People's going to get mad. People get upset. But I don't want God to be upset with me. I don't want God to say, you shouldn't have done that. You're favoring them over me. And I want to favor God. And I'm looking for some people, and you ought to be looking for some people that want to band together and let God do the work. And if this is the equivalent of a little 300 that lapped the water just right, and they're looking around, and 9,700 didn't even know how to drink water, and God said, I'll show you how to win a battle with 300 of you. God sometimes still trimming. Hear me out. God sometimes is still trimming. Then when God says, there's the right number. Victories happen when we trust God. And I'm here to tell you on the authority of God's word, and if I've got any leading from God at all, if you love God, you consider yourselves a Romans 8:28 Christian. All things work together for good to them that love God, to them who are the called according to His purpose. I'm here to tell you, you be patient. I know that tribulation worketh patience. Tribulation could be a lot of things, but I'm here to tell you, you trust God. You hang in there and find somebody and other somebodies that's going to believe God, and stick with people that will believe that. Otherwise, the big crowd is on their way to hell. Broad is the way that leads to destruction. Some people don't care about what everybody thinks. They just get in a crowd and mob mentality. What's this crowd doing? I don't know. Well, let's just join it. They're the big one, and this is the small one. Be careful. A lot of times the small one's the people that serving God, trying to do the right thing. So whatever it is you're concerned about and think it can't be done, you trust God, because God is able, the Lord is able to give thee much more than this. And He certainly is. So, Miss Vivian, you can come on. I'm going to ask you to bow your head. We're going to have an invitation this morning.